Hello, this is Mark Werawath. I wanted to go through some very basic economics of electrical energy. In particular, I want to look at the perspective of some technical innovations that have been hitting the market over the last 3 to 5 years, including battery electric vehicles, electric storage, as well as EV charging now that has onboard storage. And you'll see some of the impacts that might accrue and some of the benefits that might happen for both the grid and the users. So let's get started. I want to start with some basics in terms of making sure everyone has a decent understanding of the fact that prices on the grid fluctuate on an hourly basis. The upper left-hand chart basically shows in the green what they call the regional reference price. This is for Queensland, Australia. This is for the month of, I guess this is the month of January, the 12th and 13th. So this 24-hour period, you're basically seeing in the green line, 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Basically, what is this at 10 p.m.? No, actually 9 p.m. And then, dropping pretty dramatically until about 6 a.m. when it starts to kick up again pretty dramatically and peaking at something like 12.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So at the trough, energy is effectively free at close to 0 cents for several hours in the middle of the night, going all the way up to about 12.5 cents. So why does it vary so much? I guess if you can think about it, this is Australia. So in January, they have their summer, which is probably when they're using the most amount of electricity for air conditioning. So you're seeing probably a little bit of an exaggeration here, but this is not atypical for other parts of the world, other parts of the other countries. And other different seasons might have different, different shaped curves, but generally speaking, in the middle of the night, you will see lower prices. In the middle of the day, you will see higher prices, and usually 6 a.m. is a pretty good inflection point, as well as something like 10 p.m. as you see prices come down after about 9 or 10 p.m. So with that, also just recognize that there's a certain amount of energy efficiency that if you look at input versus output, converting fuel to electricity. Coal is one of the worst in terms of 29% efficient, oil 31, natural gas 38. As you get into solar, nuclear, hydro, geothermal, and wind, you're actually getting much, much more efficient, and you're getting outputs that far exceed the input. A lot of people ask, why should I drive an EV when effectively EVs are powered by coal? Start by this very basic concept that power generation at the plant is probably somewhere above 85–90% efficient compared to the efficiency of an internal combustion engine, which in your car is probably less than 30% efficient. So you can get 2 or 3 times the efficiency just by using energy coming off the grid versus coming from an internal combustion engine. So whenever somebody says, I don't want to drive a car run on coal, just mention the efficiencies and also mention this energy efficiency that coal is highly inefficient to begin with, 29%, by far the lowest. Okay, terms worth knowing. Net metering, this is when you sell energy generated locally back to the grid. This is at a predetermined fixed rate established by the state. Some states don't have net metering. Some others require that net metering occur at a specific rate, maybe 7, 10, 12 cents a kilowatt hour. This energy can come from a solar panel, a windmill, a battery storage device, or any other mechanism that can generate electricity and put it back onto the grid in a reasonable fashion. Arbitrage is just taking advantage of those price differences between low and high. Buying low, selling high is, obviously what most people want to do. If you have a big enough battery, it can literally sit there and take energy in when it's cheap and sell it back to the grid when it's expensive. Using net metering prices and using time of day or time of hourly pricing, as we call it here in Chicago. Frequency regulation. This is the process of maintaining a 60 hertz frequency across the grid in order to maintain stability between supply and demand, which must be maintained at all times. So again, batteries are used in this process. Grid storage is basically another form of the same thing where the grid itself has these assets and resources that they can call upon to basically deliver energy to the grid upon demand and in a very instantaneous fashion. This grid storage has to be highly responsive and being able to respond in a very short period of time. Distributed generation is a larger term that talks about this overall concept of decentralizing energy generation. So instead of having one massive centralized power plant, you now have hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of smaller generation sources, rooftop solar, wind, energy storage. It could be anything that generates electricity. And frankly, this gives the homeowners, if they have this ability, some resiliency as well to say, okay, if there's a power outage, I can generate my own power, right? V2G, using the vehicle's battery as a grid resource, absorbing energy, releasing it back to the grid as the grid requires under the command of smart grid infrastructure. So some cars today are V2G capable, and some charging systems, otherwise known as EVSEs, are also V2G capable, but this is still very, very much in its infancy. It's just getting started. And V2G is a potential way to distribute generation using electric vehicles as resources for the grid. So you don't have to keep building out huge power stations and huge generation capabilities. You will have distributed generation using V2G as a mobile grid resource, right? The smart meter, which figures into this as a monitor of the use of energy at the meter, supplying that information in real time using mesh networks. So RF, it's sending out this data that includes price, how much you're using, how fast you're using it, et cetera, time of day. All of that is included in the smart meter information. The irony, of course, is very few devices are equipped to actually do anything with this information. So the smart meter sits there waiting for equipment to interact with and to deliver the information to. So some problems today, right? Some peak demands require expensive sources of energy be brought online that happen to also have high emissions. I'm sure you've heard of peaker plants. Well, some of these peaker plants run on natural gas. And yes, they're responsive. They can respond quickly. They can spin up fast, but they also have high emissions of CO2. And they're also somewhat expensive to operate, certainly more expensive than let's say a solar panel. DC fast charging is hard to find on the road. It's expensive to deploy. They're few and far between. And my drive to, let's say, going to Colorado, it's every 50 to 100 miles, there's a DC fast charger. Why not have one every 5 miles? Well, we could get there, but not with the 350 kilowatt, 480 volt, three-phase systems that require virtually a construction permit, pouring of concrete, utilities, bringing in transformers. It's a huge project. It takes months to get such a DC fast charger without a storage capability. To get it commissioned could literally take months. Electric vehicles are expensive to procure. Imagine a school district trying to deploy electric school buses. They're often twice as expensive as a diesel bus. On top of that, you need the charging infrastructure, which most schools and school districts do not have. So here's some nice ideas, I guess, in terms of batteries as grid resources. On the left, you've got the Tesla Model Y, which has something like a 70 or 80 kilowatt hour battery pack that could be used when the car is not in motion, when the car's sitting there, which is probably out of the 24-hour day, something like 20 to 22 hours a day. It's sitting idle, it's not being used, so why not use it as a grid resource, right? On the far right, you have a Tesla Powerwall, which is literally intended to store energy for long periods of time, often bolted to the wall, sometimes in your garage or your basement, acting as backup power. But more importantly, it could also act as a grid resource as well. The grid could literally command either of these devices to, relinquish the energy or absorb energy, depending on what's needed at the time and what's excess and what's in short supply. In the middle, you have this DC fast charger from FreeWire, and these guys are not alone in this, but they're starting to put something like 120 to 150 kilowatt hour batteries inside of their charging equipment. What does this do? This reduces a whole lot of the need for that expensive construction project I mentioned before. You can run 240 volts to this thing, charge up the battery using 240 volts, while it delivers 480 volts or DC fast charge. It can deliver the 400 volt charge to the car. And the battery acts as a buffer, if you will. The battery basically charges itself up slowly and delivers energy quickly to the vehicles, reducing the need for all that capital expense, potentially also acting as a grid resource, right? So it can do net metering, it can do frequency regulation, all these things that are monetizable, right? That they can get paid for. So this can also avoid the expensive charges that happen when you take energy at the wrong times, which is sometimes known as demand charges. Demand charges can be reduced because you're smoothing out the need of energy from the grid, and you can also turn it on and off at will based on what the grid is commanding you. So all these resources can be monetized. Arbitrage, net metering, avoiding demand charges, save on energy costs, reduce capital costs, right? They can also act as home power backup and resiliency. They can act as grid resiliency. They can also act, in the case of the middle item here, the DC fast chargers, you can get them deployed much faster and much lower cost with much less construction and permitting hassles. And they can therefore become much more ubiquitous. Imagine the corner gas station ripping out gas pumps and putting in DC fast chargers like FreeWire or the equivalent of FreeWire. That's the fantasy. That's where we want to go. Lastly, imagine the possibilities, right? So you've got an electric school bus here. This one happens to be built by Lion Electric out in Joliet, Illinois. They've been building these for a few years now. Imagine all of these have vehicle to grid. They're interacting with the grid during these off hours. So when the grid is most expensive, let's say, 2 o'clock in the afternoon or even 12 noon itself, at those times, the buses are giving the energy back to the grid. And when in the middle of the night, when electricity is cheapest, it's actually charging itself up. And in between, it's monetizing in both directions. So it's selling energy back to the grid at higher prices than what it consumes. So that plus frequency regulation, you've got a fleet of vehicles here that can help school districts balance their budget and save money and hopefully fund these EVs to begin with, because as we all know, they are expensive. So with that, I am going to basically cut it off, and hopefully you see the opportunities here that EVs and the associated equipment, the batteries in particular, can bring to the energy market.